It all began in a neighborhood that seemed ordinary at first glance. Perfectly trimmed lawns, quiet streets, and the faint scent of freshly baked bread drifting from someone's kitchen in the early morning. On the surface, everything was neat, orderly, almost too perfect. But perfection often hides the cracks, and in this quiet corner of suburbia, the cracks were about to reveal something no one expected. I first noticed something unusual about our neighbor, Mrs. Lorraine Harper, during the spring HOA meeting. Her presence was familiar. She had lived on our street for nearly a decade, but that night she looked different, pale, withdrawn, clutching her cane as if her life depended on it. She spoke in a trembling voice about her recent diagnosis, about how the stress of HOA fines and neighborhood rules had made her life unbearable. The story she told was heartbreaking. We were told she had been battling a serious illness for months. Suddenly, her inability to comply with certain HOA regulations, her untrimmed hedge, the chipped paint on her mailbox was excused. Compassion washed over the room. Sympathy votes were unanimous. Fines were waived. At first, no one suspected anything. Lorraine had always seemed kind. She smiled politely at neighbors during morning walks, exchanged pleasantries, and even volunteered at the annual block party. Her life appeared simple, quiet, and predictable. And yet that night as she told her story, there was something in the way she spoke that seemed rehearsed, almost too precise. But who would question the suffering of someone allegedly battling illness? Weeks passed, neighbors went about their routines. The HOA's emails, the letters, the reminders all went unanswered by Lorraine, and she became a subject of whispered sympathy. Poor woman, people murmured, if only she'd told us sooner. Her house remained slightly unkempt, the lawn untrimmed, the flower beds overgrown, yet no one dared criticize her. We believed she was too weak, too fragile to handle even minor confrontations. Then came the day I noticed something that didn't fit her story. I was jogging past Lorraine's house early one morning when I saw her stepping out of her garage. Only she wasn't limping, her movements weren't stiff, and that cane she claimed was essential rested unused against the wall. She carried a stack of paint cans and gardening tools. My heart skipped. Had I been imagining her supposed weakness? I paused, pretending to stretch, and watched. Lorraine climbed a ladder with surprising ease, painting her garage trim with smooth, deliberate strokes. Her energy was undeniable. Confused, I decided to watch more discreetly over the next week. Each day, I saw her walking briskly to the local grocery store, sometimes carrying heavy bags, other times maneuvering through the community park. She laughed, waved at other neighbors, and even jogged short distances. It was impossible to reconcile this image with the frail, suffering woman who had spoken at the HOA meeting. My curiosity quickly turned into concern. Was she exaggerating her illness, or worse, faking it entirely? I knew that the HOA had been lenient because of her story, waiving fines that would have otherwise piled up. If her claims were false, it wasn't just deception, it was betrayal of the entire community's trust. And yet, confronting her directly felt wrong, almost cruel. I needed evidence, proof beyond doubt. I started by reviewing old HOA records, letters, emails, notices of fines, all documented meticulously. Lorraine had a history of minor violations, mostly about landscaping and paint. Until that spring, she had received multiple warnings. But after her announcement of illness, the fines stopped. Suspicion was growing, but I still lacked tangible proof. Then came the incident that confirmed my fears. One evening, I returned home to find a small group of neighbors gathered near Lorraine's driveway. A moving truck was parked and furniture was being loaded with methodical precision. But what caught my attention wasn't the move, it was Lorraine herself, bending and lifting boxes with ease. No hesitation, no pain, no signs of illness. I couldn't believe my eyes. She was physically capable, even strong. The realization hit me like a storm. Everything she had claimed about her debilitating condition was a lie. She had manipulated the HOA, the neighbors, and the community for her own convenience. Anger, disbelief, and a sense of betrayal surged through me. But how far did this deception go? I needed to know. Over the next few days, I observed her closely. Lorraine's routine was consistent. Every morning she left the house, sometimes returning late at night. Occasionally, she carried parcels that seemed suspiciously valuable. Once I saw her enter a local home improvement store, purchasing several items that would have been impossible for someone bedridden. It became clear, the illness story was a carefully constructed cover. Determined to uncover the full truth, I began talking to other neighbors discreetly. Surprisingly, many had noticed inconsistencies but had dismissed them. Some recalled seeing Lorraine jogging around the neighborhood, others remembered her attending a yoga class she supposedly couldn't have attended due to illness. Slowly, a pattern emerged. Everyone had pieces of the puzzle, but no one had put them together. As the investigation progressed, I realized Lorraine had perfected the art of deception. She had planned her story meticulously, timing her claims to coincide with the HOA's routine inspections. Her physical limitations were entirely fabricated, supported by small theatrical gestures, a cough here, a stumble there, always carefully controlled. She had exploited the community's empathy, manipulating our trust with alarming skill. Then the breaking point arrived. One afternoon, while returning from a run, I saw Lorraine arguing with a delivery driver at her front gate. The driver looked frustrated, holding a large package. Lorraine's expression was not of a sick woman but of someone entirely in control, assertive and demanding. As I watched, she signed the delivery form and handed the driver cash. Her movements were brisk, deliberate, and undeniably healthy. It was in that moment I knew I had enough to confront her, or at least to bring the truth to light. But I also understood the danger. Exposing Lorraine could unleash chaos in the community. She was clever, manipulative, and desperate. What if she retaliated? What if her lies were more deeply entrenched than I realized? I had to proceed carefully. My plan was simple but risky: gather irrefutable proof and present it to the HOA board in a way that couldn't be denied. Over the next few days, I documented everything: photos, videos, witness accounts. Each piece reinforced the same shocking reality: Lorraine Harper had faked her illness to avoid HOA fines, and she had done so with meticulous planning. And then came the evening that changed everything. Lorraine, unaware that I had been observing her, invited several neighbors over for a charity tea, a gathering under the pretense of supporting a local hospital. As they entered her home, I noticed the energy in her movements, the way she lifted teapots, rearranged chairs, and even danced briefly to a song playing softly on her radio. Every gesture screamed vitality, contradicting her narrative. That night, as the gathering concluded, I slipped away, my mind racing. The confrontation was inevitable, the exposure unavoidable. Lorraine's web of lies was unraveling, thread by thread, and yet a strange feeling lingered, a mix of fear, anticipation, and morbid curiosity. How would the community react? What lengths would Lorraine go to defend her deception? The next morning, I received a text from one of the neighbors who had attended the tea. "Did you see her today? She's amazing for someone so ill. How is she still walking so well?" The irony was bitter, almost cruel. Everyone still believed her act. Everyone, that is, except me. I knew the truth, and with it came a heavy burden. Because the truth, I realized, is never just about facts. It's about consequences. And Lorraine Harper's deception had consequences that no one could yet imagine. The lies she told were small, personal, seemingly harmless, but like a single drop of poison in a well, they threatened to contaminate everything around her. And as I watched her that morning, smiling at neighbors, waving politely, I felt a shiver run down my spine. Because sometimes the most ordinary streets conceal the darkest secrets. And sometimes those secrets are closer than we think, hiding right next door. The story was far from over. In fact, it was only beginning. The following morning felt unusually heavy, as if the air itself carried the weight of impending confrontation. I couldn't shake the feeling that Lorraine knew, or at least suspected, that someone was paying attention to her every move. She moved through the neighborhood with that same unnerving confidence, a mask of frailty hiding a core of deception. Yet beneath the mask, the facade was beginning to crack, and the smallest pressure might shatter it completely. I decided the only way forward was subtlety. If I rushed, I risked alerting her, giving her time to manipulate or hide evidence. Instead, I began compiling her patterns, cross-referencing HOA communications with sightings, deliveries, and public records. Every jog, every store visit, every casual smile at a neighbor contradicted her supposed illness. My notes became increasingly detailed: dates, times, descriptions, photographic proof. It was tedious, even exhausting, but every detail reinforced the truth. That afternoon, I made my first attempt at a soft confrontation. I walked past her house, pretending to admire the garden she had supposedly neglected. Lorraine appeared on the porch, leaning slightly against her cane, smiling politely. "Good afternoon," she said, her voice light, almost cheerful. I nodded, asking casually about her condition, hoping for a reaction. She laughed softly, an almost nervous sound. "Oh, it's manageable. Some days are harder than others," she said, gesturing vaguely. Her response didn't convince me. If anything, it confirmed my suspicion. She had rehearsed her answers, prepared for casual encounters that might expose her. The realization was chilling. This was no small lie. Lorraine had created a comprehensive character, an entire narrative designed to manipulate those around her. It wasn't just a single misstep, it was a performance perfected over time. By evening, I had arranged a small meeting with a few neighbors who had privately admitted their doubts. Gathering them felt risky. If Lorraine caught wind of it, she might adapt, escalate, or even retaliate. But the collective knowledge was necessary. Alone, I could observe; together, we could confront. We met discreetly in my garage, dimly lit, a stack of printed photos and screenshots on the table. As I laid out the evidence: images of her jogging, lifting heavy objects, attending social events, gasps echoed around the room. Faces pale, hands trembling slightly. The betrayal felt personal, almost intimate, because we had all been fooled by someone we trusted. Some neighbors had even donated to her medical fund, a small collection meant to assist with her supposed illness. Now it felt like money stolen by manipulation. "This is worse than I imagined," murmured Mrs. Patel, our longtime neighbor who had lived across the street for 15 years. "I knew something didn't add up, but I never expected this." Her voice cracked. "I've been tracking her movements for weeks," I admitted, careful to keep my tone calm. "Everything she's told us, everything she's claimed, false. The fines she avoided, the sympathy she gained, it's all based on lies." The room fell silent. Each of us processed the implications. The HOA fines weren't just financial, they represented fairness, community rules, shared responsibility. Lorraine's deception had undermined the very foundation of trust we depended on, and yet no one had confronted her directly. She thrived on invisibility, manipulating the community's empathy without ever facing consequences. We debated our next step. Some suggested confronting Lorraine outright, others worried that public exposure might backfire, provoking anger or legal threats. The safest option seemed clear: present our findings to the HOA board, but even then we needed a strategy. Lorraine had crafted her story carefully. She had rehearsed her lies for the exact moment of scrutiny. Any misstep could allow her to spin the narrative in her favor. Over the next few days, we discreetly collected additional evidence. One neighbor managed to photograph her unloading a truck of landscaping supplies, heavy soil bags, stone tiles, pots, all in clear contradiction to her claim of physical incapacity. Another captured video of her climbing a ladder to clean gutters, moving swiftly and confidently. Each piece added weight to our case but also increased the tension. Lorraine's awareness of being watched seemed almost palpable. Then came the day the HOA meeting was scheduled to address ongoing neighborhood fines. Lorraine appeared walking with her cane, flanked by two supportive neighbors she had convinced of her frailty. The room was full, tension hung in the air like a storm about to break. She spoke with calm authority, recounting her struggles, her health challenges, her fear of punitive fines. The room, once sympathetic, leaned in with curiosity, concern, and empathy. When it was my turn, I stood quietly, waiting for the right moment. As the board discussed procedural issues, I activated a tablet connected to the projector. Screens flickered to life, displaying the images and videos we had painstakingly collected over weeks. The room fell silent. Lorraine's expression froze, caught between panic and anger. "Here is evidence of your daily activities over the past several months," I began, voice steady. "Contrary to your claims, these images show full mobility, strength, and participation in activities inconsistent with the illness you reported." Gasps echoed. Faces turned from Lorraine to the screen, the weight of truth sinking in. Her carefully constructed persona, the story she had built to manipulate empathy and avoid fines, was collapsing in front of the entire community. Lorraine's lips trembled, her cane shaking slightly in her hand. This isn't fair," she stammered. "You don't understand." "I understand perfectly," said one of the HOA board members, rising. "You misled us, misrepresented your health, and manipulated the community to avoid fines. That is not only unethical, it's a violation of trust we cannot ignore." The room was tense, almost unbearably so. Lorraine's eyes darted around, searching for allies, reassurance, escape. But there were none. Her web of lies had entrapped her, and the people she had deceived were no longer willing to play along. In that moment, a quiet shift occurred. Other neighbors, emboldened by the confrontation, began sharing their own experiences, times they had seen her jogging, carrying heavy loads, attending social events she claimed she couldn't manage. The collective evidence was overwhelming, undeniable. Lorraine's defenses, carefully rehearsed for months, crumbled piece by piece. Yet even as the truth became unavoidable, there was a strange, almost tragic dimension to it. Here was a woman living a double life, so consumed by fear of fines and social judgment that she had fabricated an entire illness. Her deception wasn't just criminal or selfish, it was profoundly human. Fear, desperation, and insecurity had driven her to manipulate everyone around her. The HOA board took immediate action. Fines were reinstated, the community formally addressed the breach of trust, and Lorraine was given an opportunity to respond. She remained silent for several moments, then muttered vague apologies, her face pale, lips quivering. Some neighbors felt a flicker of sympathy, others anger. The room was a storm of emotions, yet one truth was undeniable: Lorraine Harper's deception had been exposed. As the meeting adjourned, I stepped outside, feeling both relief and unease. The confrontation was over, but the aftermath would linger. How would Lorraine cope with the revelation? How would the neighborhood reconcile the betrayal, the loss of trust, the shock of manipulation? The truth, once revealed, has a way of reshaping everything around it. That evening, the street was unusually quiet. Lorraine's house seemed darker, more closed off than ever. I watched from a distance, curiosity and apprehension twisting inside me. The confrontation had ended, yes, but the story was far from over. Secrets don't vanish, they fester, linger, and sometimes explode when least expected. And as I walked back to my own house, the realization settled in: exposing a lie is only the beginning. The ripple effects, the consequences, and the hidden depths of human behavior are what follow. And in a neighborhood that once seemed ordinary, the ordinary had vanished. In its place was a tension, a suspense, and a mystery that would echo for months to come. Because some deceptions aren't just lies, they're carefully constructed realities that, once dismantled, leave everyone questioning not only the person who deceived them but themselves. And for Lorraine Harper, the quiet suburb she had manipulated so expertly was no longer a haven, it was a stage for the fallout of her own making. The next steps were uncertain, but one thing was clear: in a community built on trust, betrayal leaves scars that no apology can erase. And sometimes the most shocking revelations are just the beginning of a much deeper story. The confrontation at the HOA meeting had left the neighborhood shaken. People whispered in hushed tones, glancing toward Lorraine's house with a mix of suspicion and lingering curiosity. Some neighbors avoided her entirely, while others, unsure of how to process the betrayal, lingered near her property, pretending to admire their own gardens or exchange casual greetings. The sense of unease was palpable, like a storm hanging just above the rooftops, threatening to break at any moment. Lorraine herself became a ghost within her own home. Gone was the confident facade, the rehearsed frailty that had once drawn pity and protection from the community. Now she moved silently, almost invisibly, her sharp eyes darting behind curtains, observing anyone who dared approach. The mask had slipped, revealing the core of a woman cornered, desperate, and uncertain. Her house, once neat and orderly, began to show signs of neglect. Mail piled up, the yard grew unruly, and small cracks in her perfect life became impossible to hide. But what no one realized yet was that Lorraine wasn't finished. Exposing her lie didn't end the story, it triggered her next move. She had survived by being clever, by manipulating appearances, and now, facing scrutiny, she would adapt. The question was not whether she would act, but how and to what extent. I continued my observations, not out of malice, but from a desire to understand the full scope of what had happened. Over the next few days, I noticed a pattern. Lorraine began small, repositioning flower pots to suggest that someone had cared for them, leaving lights on at odd hours to create the illusion of activity, even placing a chair on her porch to imply she was resting, as she had claimed during the HOA meeting. It was almost theatrical, a desperate attempt to maintain the remnants of her credibility. Yet the deeper I looked, the more disturbing it became. Lorraine wasn't just trying to regain trust, she was testing boundaries, probing for weaknesses in the community's memory. She would wave at neighbors, but only from a distance, never engaging directly. She left cryptic notes on doors expressing vague remorse, yet the words felt hollow, rehearsed. It was manipulation in its purest form, a psychological game designed to unsettle and confuse. Then came the moment that shocked everyone. One afternoon, a young mother, Mrs. Dawson, approached me with trembling hands. "I think Lorraine is doing more than just pretending to be sick," she whispered, glancing over her shoulder. "I saw her leaving her house late last night. She was carrying something large, heavy, something that didn't belong to her." Her voice faltered, the fear evident. That was all it took. My curiosity transformed into urgency. I had suspected deception, but now there were hints of something larger, something more calculated. Over the next several nights, I began a careful, discreet surveillance of Lorraine's movements. Using binoculars from a safe distance, I observed her leaving the house under cover of darkness, returning hours later, carrying different objects each time. Boxes, bags, even small furniture pieces appeared and disappeared from her porch with a precision that suggested planning. It wasn't just theft, or so it seemed. Lorraine's activities were methodical, deliberate, almost ritualistic. She moved with purpose, carefully avoiding detection, leaving only the faintest traces behind. And yet, despite her intelligence, there were mistakes, small details that betrayed her. A forgotten delivery slip here, a door left slightly ajar there, a neighbor who happened to notice her activity and mentioned it in passing. Each misstep added pieces to the puzzle, and the puzzle was growing larger than anyone anticipated. As the days passed, the neighborhood's fear and suspicion grew. People no longer waved casually in the morning or exchanged greetings over the fence. Conversations became whispered exchanges behind closed doors. Some residents even considered moving, unable to cope with the tension and uncertainty. The sense of normalcy that had once defined the street was gone, replaced by paranoia, mistrust, and a lingering question: what exactly was Lorraine hiding? Determined to uncover the truth, I enlisted the help of a few trusted neighbors who shared my concern. We set up a discreet observation schedule, each of us monitoring different hours, different angles. Lorraine was meticulous, but no one is perfect. Within a week, we had documented enough anomalies to suggest something far beyond the original deception of her illness. Items being moved under cover of night, trips to local businesses that seemed unrelated to daily needs, cryptic communications with unknown individuals, all pointed toward a deeper, more complex web of lies. The breaking point came unexpectedly. One evening I noticed Lorraine struggling with a particularly large box near the back of her property. It was heavy, awkward, and clearly intended for transport. But this time she wasn't alone. A man I had never seen before appeared from the shadows, helping her lift the box into a waiting vehicle. They moved quickly, silently, disappearing down the street without drawing attention. My heart raced. Who was he? What was inside the box? And why had she risked exposure with someone else involved? The next day, rumors began to circulate. Neighbors whispered about late-night visitors, unfamiliar cars parked briefly on the street, and Lorraine's increasingly erratic behavior. Fear began to spread like wildfire. What had started as a simple case of faked illness had escalated into something far more sinister, something no one could ignore. At that moment, I realized we were dealing with more than a lie. Lorraine's deception was evolving, and it was now intertwined with a network of secrecy and hidden activity. The street had become a stage for a psychological battle, and Lorraine was the unseen director, orchestrating events with calculated precision. The stakes were higher than anyone had anticipated, and every action, every observation, every word mattered. I decided it was time for a more direct approach. Using the evidence we had gathered, videos, photographs, eyewitness accounts, we scheduled another HOA meeting. This time, the goal was not just exposure, but to uncover the full scope of Lorraine's deception and prevent further disruption to the community. The day arrived, tense and heavy with anticipation. Neighbors filed into the HOA hall quietly, many avoiding Lorraine's gaze entirely. She entered last, her posture stiff, her eyes darting nervously. Gone was the rehearsed frailty of before. She seemed smaller somehow, diminished under the weight of scrutiny. When it was my turn to speak, I presented the evidence we had collected over the previous weeks. Photos of her nightly departures, videos of her lifting heavy objects, records of deliveries inconsistent with her claims of incapacity, all laid bare for the entire room to see. The silence was suffocating. Lorraine's face paled, her lips quivering as the realization set in. The community had uncovered the full extent of her deception. She tried to speak, to explain, but her words faltered. I didn't mean, her voice broke, tears welling in her eyes, but the damage was done. The board members, neighbors, everyone present had witnessed the truth. Lorraine's web of lies, carefully constructed and maintained for months, had collapsed under the weight of collective observation and evidence. Yet even in her humiliation, there was a strange, almost tragic dignity. The woman who had manipulated and deceived was now exposed, not through punishment or confrontation alone, but through the collective resolve of a community unwilling to be manipulated further. It was a reminder that deception, no matter how clever, cannot withstand scrutiny when enough people commit to uncovering the truth. The fallout was immediate. Fines were reinstated, the community formally acknowledged the breach of trust, and Lorraine was required to participate in mandatory counseling and restitution. Neighbors, though shaken, began to rebuild trust, cautiously returning to routines, conversations, and the semblance of normal life. And yet, a lingering tension remained. Lorraine had been clever, calculating, and deeply manipulative. Could we truly trust that she had been fully honest about her motives and intentions now, or was this just another stage in her performance, another layer of deception waiting to unfold? The questions hung in the air, unanswered, as the street slowly returned to a semblance of calm. As I walked past Lorraine's house one evening, I noticed her sitting quietly on the porch. Gone was the confident, manipulative persona. In its place was a woman diminished, silent, and watching the world cautiously. I couldn't tell if she had learned anything, or if this was merely a pause in a larger, ongoing act. The mystery remained unresolved, and a shiver ran down my spine. Because in neighborhoods like ours, appearances are everything and reality is fragile. One lie can spiral into a chain of deception, and even when exposed, its consequences echo far beyond the initial act. Lorraine Harper had faked illness to avoid fines, but the story had grown into something larger, a tale of manipulation, trust, and the unexpected resilience of a community unwilling to be deceived. The truth, I realized, is never simple. And in the quiet streets of suburbia, where every lawn, every porch, every neighbor's smile seemed ordinary, the ordinary had vanished. In its place was a story of deception, exposure, and the complex web of human behavior that can hide behind the most ordinary facades. And for Lorraine Harper, the revelation was just the beginning. The weeks after the HOA confrontation were strange and quiet, almost eerily so. Lorraine Harper's house had transformed from a place of subtle influence to one of suspicion and caution. Curtains remained drawn, lights were dimmed, and the once active garden had become overgrown, almost wild. She rarely ventured outside, and when she did, it was with eyes darting nervously, as if every neighbor was a potential threat. The community, though relieved that the deception had been exposed, could not shake the tension that lingered like a shadow over the street. I continued to observe, not out of obsession but from a sense of responsibility. The truth had been revealed, yet the aftermath of her manipulation remained unresolved. How would Lorraine navigate a neighborhood that no longer trusted her? And how would the community process the emotional betrayal that went beyond fines and rules, something deeper, more personal? One evening, I noticed a faint movement through the living room window of Lorraine's house. She sat hunched over a stack of papers, meticulously writing, crossing out lines, and rewriting notes with a trembling hand. It was clear she was trying to explain, perhaps to justify her actions or maybe to seek a form of redemption. I couldn't see the contents, but the intensity of her effort suggested desperation. The following morning, neighbors found a handwritten letter slid under doors across the street. It was from Lorraine. The letter was long, heartfelt, and trembling with emotion. She admitted to faking her illness, explaining that it had begun as fear of judgment, fear of fines, fear of being unable to maintain appearances. She described how her life had spiraled into deception, how small lies had grown into a complex web, and how she had never intended to harm anyone, even as the lies became larger and more consequential. Reading the letter, I felt a mixture of emotions, pity, anger, and a strange sense of closure. Lorraine's confession didn't erase the betrayal, but it revealed something human beneath the manipulations. Fear, insecurity, and desperation had driven her actions, and perhaps in admitting her lies, she was attempting the first real step toward accountability. The HOA board, now fully aware of the scope of her deception, convened another meeting. This time the focus was on restitution and community healing rather than simple exposure. Lorraine appeared, holding the same cane she had once used as a prop, but this time without pretense. Her posture was rigid, nervous, but not theatrical. She apologized formally, her voice shaking as she addressed the neighbors she had manipulated for months. "I cannot undo what I've done," she began, "and I know apologies are not enough. But I want to take responsibility to make amends and to rebuild the trust I've broken." Some neighbors remained skeptical. Others, moved by the sincerity or perhaps the vulnerability of her words, nodded slowly. The tension in the room was heavy, charged with a mixture of lingering anger and cautious hope. The HOA board announced that fines would be reinstated, and Lorraine would also contribute to community projects as restitution. Beyond the financial aspect, there was an unspoken expectation. She had to rebuild trust, earn it through actions rather than words. Over the following weeks, I witnessed a subtle transformation. Lorraine began to participate in community activities once more, this time without theatrical gestures or exaggerated stories. She helped clean up the local park, attended neighborhood meetings, and even assisted with minor landscaping projects. Her energy, previously a tool of deception, was now applied constructively. Yet trust was slow to return. Some neighbors remained distant, observing her cautiously, unwilling to forget the months of manipulation. Conversations were polite but guarded, smiles were tentative. The psychological scars of betrayal lingered. It was a reminder that while lies can be exposed, the emotional impact of deceit leaves a lasting mark. One afternoon, I approached Lorraine as she worked on a flower bed near the community center. She looked up, startled, then relaxed slightly when she recognized me. "You don't have to watch me anymore," she said quietly, a small, wry smile breaking through her nervousness. "I understand if no one trusts me yet." "I'm not here to judge," I replied. "I just wanted to see if things could start to get better." She nodded, bending down to tend a particularly stubborn patch of weeds. "I have to rebuild," she said. "Every action, every day, I need to prove I can be honest." And that perhaps was the most important lesson. Trust, once broken, can't be restored overnight. It requires consistent effort, humility, and transparency. Lorraine Harper had learned this the hard way. Her lie, initially small and seemingly harmless, had escalated into a web of deceit affecting an entire community. But through accountability, confession, and sincere effort, she had begun the slow path toward redemption. Months passed. The neighborhood, cautious but resilient, began to regain a sense of normalcy. Children played on lawns, neighbors chatted over fences, and the quiet rhythm of suburbia returned. Lorraine's presence was still met with scrutiny, yet over time, tentative gestures of trust began to appear. Small interactions, a wave, a smile, a neighbor asking for advice on gardening, marked the subtle rebuilding of relationships. The incident left an enduring mark on the community. Conversations about HOA rules, trust, and accountability became more frequent, and neighbors became more attentive, not out of suspicion but out of awareness. The story of Lorraine Harper served as a cautionary tale, a vivid reminder that appearances can be deceiving, that even small lies can have significant consequences, and that human behavior often hides layers of complexity beneath the surface. In the quiet moments when the street was empty and the sun dipped low, I would sometimes glance toward Lorraine's house. She was often there, tending her garden or quietly watching the world, no longer performing, no longer manipulating. There was a sense of humility in her actions now, a recognition of her past mistakes and a commitment to live authentically. And yet, a lingering question remained, one that perhaps will never be fully answered. Had she truly changed, or was this simply the next stage of another carefully constructed persona? The truth in these quiet neighborhoods is never simple. People can reinvent themselves, but the echoes of past deception remain, shaping perceptions, influencing interactions, and reminding everyone that trust is fragile. Lorraine Harper's story ended not with punishment alone, but with a blend of accountability, confession, and tentative redemption. She had faked illness to avoid HOA fines, deceived an entire community, and manipulated empathy for months. But in facing exposure, acknowledging her wrongdoing, and beginning the slow, deliberate process of restitution, she became more than a liar. She became a reminder of the complexity of human behavior, the consequences of deceit, and the resilience of a community united by honesty and scrutiny. As the sun set over the quiet neighborhood, casting long shadows across the trimmed lawns and orderly streets, a sense of closure settled, but not complacency. Lorraine's deception had ended, yet the story remained a vivid memory, a lesson etched into the fabric of the community. Trust had been tested, deception revealed, and morality confronted. And in the end, that is the story of human nature, fragile, complex, and endlessly compelling. Because in every neighborhood, behind every closed door, behind every polite smile, there is a story waiting to be uncovered. And sometimes it begins with a lie, but it is the truth, eventually revealed, that leaves the deepest impact.